A major social and especially environmental event in the midst of the Great Depression is the Dust Bowl. Now, this takes place in the Great Plains states, and the geography is very important to this. This is traditionally the heartland of America, the breadbasket, and it's known for these tall grasses, the amber waves of grain, if you will. Now, in the 1920s, there was just the perfect amount of moisture. It wasn't too dry, it wasn't soggy, but there was a lot of rain in the Great Plains states, so that meant that things grew quite well. Lots and lots of farming, and as we've mentioned before, with more introduction of mechanization and industrialization, this area gets farmed too much, in fact. Kind of runs down the soil a little bit. Then, beginning in the early 1930s, we have the issue of droughts. Now, the problem with these droughts, if it was only 1 or 2 years, it wouldn't be that bad. But the issue is the soil itself. These tall grasses had been removed to make way for agricultural beds for crops. And the problem is those tall grasses were really important in sort of tying together the soil, the topsoil, to the ground, if that makes sense. So when there's drought, there's no longer anything to keep the soil connected to the ground. And then it gets really, really windy, and these huge dust storms are created. There's another picture showing just how big these can be. And we watched a clip of the PBS series in class about the Dust Bowl and just what an impact it had on people. What farmland was left ends up being destroyed. People's homes become almost flooded with dust, and these people can't make a living for themselves. They are mostly farmers. If they can't farm, they can't make money. If they can't make money, they can't pay their mortgage or they can't pay their rent. So they're looking for somewhere else to go where they can make money. And many of them go to the West Coast, specifically California. They pack up what little they have left in the world, what few possessions are still to their name, and they travel along Route 66. Now, people are coming from all of these states, but they get the nickname the Okies because so many people were coming from Oklahoma. But even if you were coming from Colorado or Texas or Nebraska, you still probably would have been called an Okie. Migrant camps are set up in California, and these people are intending to be migrant farm laborers. And this photo is taken, this photo is called Pea Pickers Resting. And this is a photo by Dorothea Lange. It's probably the most famous photograph of the Great Depression. And so these farmers, these proud people who had owned land and controlled their destiny because of this environmental disaster, are now at the beck and call of the farmers and the growers in California. And these people are traveling from place to place trying to make a living. And John Steinbeck, who's an American author, he writes about this. He goes to these migrant camps, and he writes a series of articles that become known as Harvest Gypsies. And you read this partly in class and for your assignment. And he uses this first-hand experience, getting to know these people, to write his famous novel, Grapes of Wrath. It was also made into a movie and won lots of awards. But he's trying to show what the problems are and what can we do to humanize these people rather than seeing them as a nuisance. So what is the legacy of the New Deal? Did it work? Was it successful? The answer is kinda. There are some groups that end up being left out, that end up being discriminated against, that don't get the same benefits as the rest of the country. The first group we have are the African Americans, A lot of this has to do with their occupation. Many African Americans were still involved in farming, especially in the South. So the issues with the overproduction of the 1920s, now there's not going to be as much demand, so their wages are essentially going to go down. In an urban area, the issue of unemployment is going to come up. When there are jobs available in most of the country, if a job is open, it would probably be given to a white man first rather than a black man. So the African American community experienced far more unemployment than the general population. General population was about 25% unemployment. African American population unemployment is at 75%. And FDR is trying to do what he can to stop this discrimination. One way he does this is he nominates what he called the Black Cabinet. I mean, the cabinet are the people who run up the different offices that run under the executive department. But the Black Cabinet was more about getting advisors, getting African American community leaders to talk to President Roosevelt on a regular basis, talk about race issues. How can we get these New Deal programs to the Black Americans who need them? And this was really encouraged by his wife, Eleanor. But even with this desire to want to help the African Americans, there are still problems. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, this is what is giving farmers subsidies not to plant certain things. That was only for farmers who own their own farms. The problem is most African American farmers were tenant farmers or sharecroppers, so they're not going to get the benefits of these programs. President Roosevelt tries to create federal programs that force non-discrimination against the African Americans, particularly in hiring, but at a local level, it's really hard to enforce that. We also have the issue of the Klan. The Ku Klux Klan is unfortunately still active. They are still entirely racist and doing as much as they can to intimidate blacks, to lynch them even. So the craziness is still going on. Thankfully, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons, it is going to team up with unions in order to hopefully get better working conditions, access to programs, and the unions that had for a long time, in general, not been pro-African American, we see that these two groups are trying to cooperate and help each other. Another group, the Latinos. This is primarily people of Mexican origin, and they were already mostly involved as migrant laborers. They would be in low-wage jobs, sometimes in industry, but very similar to the Okies coming out for the Dust Bowl. These are people who are going to travel from place to place working along with the harvest. When the Dust Bowl settlers come to California, they are going to be given jobs first simply because they're white. So these Latino families are forced to move into neighborhoods and urban areas that we would now call the barrio. And part of this is they are not being accepted in the wider culture, so they are going to establish their own. But we know human nature is to fear the different or to fear whatever is separate. So these people are being discriminated against because they live in these neighborhoods. But they're living in these neighborhoods because they are being discriminated against. So it is definitely a paradox. There are certainly many Mexican Americans who are citizens. They might experience discrimination, certainly. But for those that are not citizens, immigration rounds them up and is going to deport them. Over 500,000 deportations happened of citizens being sent back to Mexico. So not everything is going well under the New Deal. Even for women, while even for white women, they might be seen as equal, in the job market, they aren't. Women were involved in the workplace during the First World War, but once the war ends, that's no longer needed. Men came back, they needed jobs. Especially now in the Great Depression, men need those jobs because they're the providers for the family. So this idea that women are not providing for their family, that it's more important that a man has a job, we see sort of what's still going on today, that there is a pay gap. There's a gender pay gap. Women leave clerical jobs and office jobs or production jobs. Many of them do go into teaching, and this is where we really start to see that teaching becomes, more often than not, a female profession, even though men can be very excellent teachers. And a lot of this is based on education. If you can't afford to get an education, what jobs are available to you? Eleanor Roosevelt is going to be essential in trying to draw her husband's attention to these people, the marginalized, those on the fringes of society, and trying to argue for programs and things that would benefit them. And as I've mentioned before, Frances Perkins is a big part of that. She is named Secretary of Labor. She is the first woman to be in the cabinet. Overall, what we see with the New Deal is the power of the president and the role of the president. And one of the analogies that historian George Will has used is that the presidency is like a leather glove. And FDR really stretched out that glove. And one issue with that is it's hard to shrink it back to the original size. Also, the Democratic Party just experiences a huge resurgence. We see this with African Americans who had previously been staunchly Republican because the Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln. But people start to look to the Democratic Party as this is what they stand for, of programs that help the American public. And there are lots and lots of programs, but two programs that continue to exist today, we've got the Social Security Administration, as well as the Tennessee Valley Authority. Also the FDIC, and there are all other things, but I think especially the Social Security Administration. It was established to help alleviate poverty, but it now is just part of our society, and sometimes it's more complicated than the benefits it provides. What we also see with the New Deal is how, in general, the American public comes to rely upon the government, and the government intervenes when there is a problem. Those who are classically liberal, or what we would say today conservative, they become very wary of this. And President Ronald Reagan famously said, "The scariest words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government, I'm here to help.'" So FDR's New Deal really was trying to meet the needs of citizens in the Great Depression, but it also creates long-lasting impacts for Americans today.